Sundar Pichai sat quietly in the back seat of a simple black car, looking out at the crowded streets of San Jose. The sunlight flickered through the window, touching his tired face as if gently reminding him that even the busiest men need a moment of peace. His phone buzzed every few seconds, emails flooding in from different parts of the world. Yet on that morning, Sundar decided to keep it on silent. Today was supposed to be a rare, quiet day, a day for reflection, for remembering where he had come from and where he was going next. The car rolled to a slow stop near a small McDonald's, the kind that looked ordinary, just like any other fast food restaurant in America. Sundar had asked the driver to stop so he could get a simple breakfast, something he had loved since his early days in America. He stepped out, adjusting his thin jacket, feeling the crisp air hit his face. He didn't wear a suit today, just a plain shirt and jeans. He wanted to feel normal, just another man ordering a meal, not the CEO of Google. As he walked inside, the familiar smell of French fries and sizzling burgers wrapped around him, a nostalgic hug that reminded him of late-night study sessions and cheat meals when he was a student. The place was almost empty, except for a mother with a small child in the corner and a few teenagers, laughing quietly over their milkshakes. Sundar stepped up to the counter, scanning the menu even though he already knew what he wanted. A young cashier looked up, ready to take his order, but then Sundar's eyes shifted to the kitchen. There, moving quickly and quietly, was a man who looked oddly familiar. Sundar's heart skipped a beat. He squinted, trying to be sure. The man turned slightly, revealing a tired but kind face. A face Sundar knew from another world entirely. It was Rajeev, a former director at Google. Rajeev had once been a powerful voice in the company, a man who led massive teams, inspired young engineers, and stood by Sundar during difficult decisions. Sundar remembered long meetings late into the year. Night, Rajev's strong opinions, his deep voice filled with passion for innovation. Yet here he was now, wearing a faded McDonald's uniform, his hands moving swiftly as he assembled burgers. He looked older, thinner, and there was a sadness in his eyes that even from afar Sundar could feel. Sundar felt a sudden wave of emotions rushing through him: shock, sadness, confusion, and a deep curiosity about what had happened to the man he once admired so much. The cashier repeated politely, "Sir, are you ready to order?" Sundar snapped out of his thoughts and quickly placed his order, his mind still spinning. He moved to the side, pretending to check his phone while keeping his eyes on Rajeev. He watched as Rajeev carefully handed out orders, smiling softly at customers. There was no sign of pride or arrogance, only a quiet acceptance. Sundar couldn't believe what he was seeing. He felt an urge to go straight to him, to ask questions, to offer help, but he hesitated. He didn't want to embarrass Rajeev in front of others. He decided to wait until Rajev's shift ended. He picked a table in the corner, sitting with his coffee and breakfast sandwich, but his mind was far from the food. While he waited, Sundar's mind wandered back to the past. He remembered the first time he met Rajeev in the Google office, both of them much younger, hungry to change the world. Rajeev was brilliant, fearless, sometimes too stubborn for his own good, but his heart was always in the right place. He fought for his team and for ideas he believed would make people's lives better. Sundar wondered what could have driven Rajeev from such heights to this small kitchen in McDonald's. Was it a mistake? A personal tragedy? A choice he took? A sip of his coffee, his hands slightly shaking. He realized in that moment that no matter how high a person rises, life has its own mysterious ways of testing them. It was a sobering thought. Sundar felt a deep respect growing inside him for Rajev's quiet strength. Time moved slowly as Sundar watched the customers come and go. Finally, after what felt like hours, Rajeev removed his gloves and apron. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and stepped out to take a short break. Sundar stood up quietly, following him outside.
Rajeev
Found a spot near the sidewall, pulling out a small bottle of water. He leaned against the wall, taking slow sips, looking at the sky with a distant expression. Sundar felt his heart pounding as he approached, took a deep breath, and softly said, "Rajeev." Rajeev turned sharply, his eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, He looked as if he might not recognize Sundar, but then his face softened, and his eyes filled with something hard to describe: surprise, joy, maybe even shame. Double quote, Sundar. "What are you doing here?" Rajeev asked, his voice low and cautious. Sundar stepped closer, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. He wanted to. Rajeev, to shake him, to understand everything. "I came for breakfast. ... But I think I found something much more important," Sundar said, his voice calm but firm. Rajeev laughed weakly, shaking his head. "I didn't expect anyone from the old world to find me here," he said, his eyes dropping to the ground. Sundar reached out, placing a hand on Rajeev's shoulder. "Why are you here, Rajeev? What happened?" Sundar's words were gentle, but they carried a weight that made Rajeev sigh deeply. After a long silence, Rajeev began to speak, his voice soft but clear. He shared how he had left Google after a series of disagreements with the board, how he felt his ideas were being ignored, and how he had tried to start his own tech company. He invested his savings, worked day and night, but the company failed. Investors pulled out, debts piled up, and soon he found himself without a home, without a family to lean on. The story unfolded like a tragic song, each word heavy with pain. Sundar listened closely, his heart breaking with every sentence. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge, just stood there, listening like a true friend. "I didn't want to reach out to anyone," Rajeev said finally. "I was too proud, I thought. I could fix everything myself, but I was wrong." Sundar squeezed his shoulder gently. "There is no shame in asking for help, Rajeev," he whispered. Rajeev looked up, his eyes shiny with unshed tears. "I thought about you many times," Rajeev admitted, "but I couldn't bring myself to call." Sundar nodded slowly. "You are not alone, Rajeev. You never were," he said. The words seemed to unlock something inside Rajeev. His face crumbled, and tears began to fall. Sundar stepped forward and pulled him into a tight hug, holding him as he sobbed silently against his chest. The cars passed by on the road, people hurried along the sidewalk, but for those few moments, it felt like the world had stopped for the two men. After a while, Rajeev pulled back, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. "Thank you, Sundar," he said softly. Sundar shook his head. "Don't thank me. We are family, always," he replied. There was a long pause between them, filled with unspoken words, shared memories, and a deep understanding that only old friends can feel. Sundar looked at Rajeev's uniform, then at his tired face, and something inside him shifted. He knew he couldn't just walk away and leave Rajeev there. He had to do something. "I to help him find his light again. Come with me," Sundar said suddenly. Rajeev looked confused. "Where?" he asked. "Just trust me," Sundar replied, a small but determined smile on his face. Rajeev hesitated, glancing back at the kitchen door. "I still have my shift," he said, almost apologetically. Sundar shook his head. "This is more important," he insisted. With a deep breath, Rajeev nodded. He stepped inside, told his manager he needed to leave, returned to Sundar's side a few minutes later, holding a small backpack. Together, they walked toward Sundar's car, the quiet hum of the city around them. As they drove away, Sundar looked over at Rajeev and smiled. "We're going to fix this," he promised. Rajeev didn't say much during the drive. He stared out the window, his thoughts clearly running wild. Sundar didn't push him to talk. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, his mind already planning the next steps. He thought about the ways he could help Rajeev rebuild his life, not just with money but with purpose, dignity, and respect. He knew it wouldn't be easy. People who have fallen so hard often lose trust in themselves. But Sundar believed in Rajeev. He believed that the same passion and brilliance that once lit up Google's halls still lived. Somewhere inside his friend, the car finally stopped in front of a quiet guest house owned by one of Sundar's close friends. It was a peaceful place, with a small garden and a few comfortable rooms. Sundar helped Rajeev carry his things inside. "We'll stay here for now," Sundar said gently. Rajeev looked around, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. Sundar shook his head. You don't need to say anything right now. Just rest, he said. Rajeev sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. Sundar stood by the door for a moment, watching him, then turned to leave. Before he could step out, Rajeev called, "Out, Sundar!" Sundar turned back. Rajeev looked up, his eyes filled with gratitude and fear. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said, his voice breaking. Sundar smiled softly. "Never," he replied. As Sundar walked out into the afternoon sun, he felt a strange mix of heaviness and relief in his heart. He knew this was only the beginning of a long journey for Rajeev. There would be many challenges ahead, many moments of doubt and struggle. But he also knew that with kindness, respect, and patience, they could bring back the spark in Rajeev's. Sundar took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through the endless emails, and then put it back into his pocket. Today he decided he would not be a CEO. Today he would be a friend. As he drove away, his mind replayed Rajeev's story again and again. He thought about all the people around the world who silently carry their pain, too proud or too scared to ask for help. He promised himself that he would use his influence to create more spaces for compassion and understanding in the tech world and beyond. He knew that helping Rajeev was just the first step, and that there was a bigger mission waiting for him, a mission beyond profits and success. And as the sun began to set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Sundar felt something shift inside him. He didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but he knew that he would face it with an open heart. He whispered to himself, "We're all just human." And for the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace. But just as he turned the corner, his phone buzzed urgently. A message from Google headquarters appeared on the screen. Urgent. "We need you back immediately. It's about Rajeev." Sundar's heart stopped, pulled over, staring at the message, his mind racing with questions. What could it be? What had he missed? His fingers trembled as he started the engine again, knowing that everything was about to change, as Sundar Pichai sat frozen in his car. The glow of the message from Google headquarters lit up his tired face. The words echoed in his mind over and over: urgent. We need you back immediately. It's about Rajeev. He felt a tight knot forming in his stomach, a sharp twist of fear mixed with confusion. He had just found Rajeev helped him take the first step toward healing, and now this sudden, urgent message threatened to pull everything apart before it even began. Sundar's fingers hovered over his phone as 1,000 thoughts rushed through. His head, he took a long breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew he had to face whatever this was head-on, for Rajeev and for the truth that waited behind this unexpected message. With a deep sigh, Sundar started the car again, the engine's gentle hum barely loud enough to cover the storm inside his heart. He drove carefully through the crowded streets, each traffic light feeling like an eternity. As he drove, his mind drifted back to the early days at Google when Rajeev and he would sit side by side in the large glass meeting rooms late into the night. They argued, dreamed, and built visions for the future that once seemed impossible, but later became part of everyday life for millions. Rajeev wasn't just a colleague. He was a brother, a mentor, a fighter for ideas that dared to change the world. Sundar's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he wondered what kind of secret or crisis from those days could still be haunting Rajeev now. Finally, Sundar pulled up to Google headquarters, a massive glass building that looked almost like a giant shimmering spaceship in the afternoon sun. Security guards quickly recognized him, nodding respectfully and opening the gates without question. He parked in his private spot, stepped out, and felt the familiar sharp click of his shoes against the smooth pavement echo in his ears. Walked toward the entrance. Employees paused, whispering quietly, some bowing slightly out of respect. Sundar offered small nods in return, but his mind was too preoccupied to fully notice them. He took the elevator up, watching the numbers slowly climb higher, each beep sending small waves of anxiety through him. When he stepped out on the top floor, his closest assistant, Maya, was already waiting. She looked worried, her face pale, and her hands fidgeting with her tablet. "Sir, thank God you're here," she said in a hushed tone. "They're waiting inside. They say it's urgent and ... very sensitive." Sundar nodded without saying a word. He pushed open the large, Glass doors to the main conference room, the cold air from the room's powerful AC hitting his face instantly. Inside, several board members and senior executives sat around a long, polished table, their faces stiff and eyes serious. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were listening. Sundar. "Please sit," said James, the head of security, his voice low and cautious. Sundar pulled out a chair slowly and sat down, his eyes scanning each face for clues. James leaned forward and spoke again. "We received some information this morning from an internal source. It's about Rajeev," he began, carefully choosing each word. "Apparently years ago, Rajeev discovered something. A vulnerability in our core system that could have been catastrophic. He reported it, but the board at the time ignored him. After repeated warnings, he resigned. We think he might have kept copies of his research and reports. Now, someone is threatening to release that information to the public." Sundar felt like the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. His mouth went dry, and his mind raced to connect the dots. "Are you saying Rajeev was right all along?" he finally asked, his voice shaking slightly. James nodded solemnly. "We didn't take his warnings seriously enough. Now it appears that someone close to him more. Someone who found his documents is trying to blackmail us. They demand a huge sum of money, or they will leak everything, possibly putting millions of users at risk and destroying the company's reputation." Sundar closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. He remembered how Rajeev often warned them about security holes, his voice echoing passionately in those late-night meetings. Rajeev wasn't being stubborn. He was trying to protect them all. "We need to find Rajeev and talk to him immediately," Sundar said firmly, opening his eyes again. The room fell silent, everyone looking at him, waiting for direction. Sundar stood up suddenly, pushing the chair back with a loud scrape. "I know where he is. I'll bring him here," he declared. The board members shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging worried glances. "Are you sure that's wise?" "He might be unpredictable." One of them whispered. Sundar shot him a sharp look. "He's not dangerous." "He's hurt, and he needs to be heard," Sundar replied, his voice steady and strong. Without waiting for further objections, he turned and left the room, steps echoing with determination. As he hurried back to the car, Sundar's mind played. Images of Rajiv's tired face, the quiet sadness in his eyes, the lost dreams he carried alone for so long. Sundar knew this was bigger than just a technical flaw. It was about trust, friendship, and the invisible scars that people hide. He drove faster this time, his heart pounding with urgency. When he arrived at the guest house, he found Rajeev sitting in the small garden, looking at the flowers lost. In thought, Sundar ran to him, his breathing heavy, his words tumbling out before he could catch them. "Rajeev, we need to go," Sundar said, grabbing his arm. Rajeev looked up, startled. "What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. "It's about the system vulnerability you discovered years ago. Someone is using it to threaten us now." "We need your help," Sundar explained quickly. Rajiv's face turned pale, his eyes wide with shock. He stood up slowly, his hands shaking. I didn't mean for this to happen," he stammered. Sundar squeezed his shoulder firmly. "I know, but you're the only one who truly understands it. We need you," he said. Rajeev hesitated for a second, then nodded, his eyes filled. With a mix of fear and determination, they drove back in silence, the air heavy between them. Rajeev looked out the window, his mind lost in the past, replaying every warning he had given, every door that had closed in his face. Sundar glanced at him from time to time, his own thoughts. A whirlwind of guilt and responsibility. He realized how blind they had all been. How easy it was to dismiss one man's warnings when they were chasing profits and growth. He promised himself silently that he would never allow that kind of ignorance again. When they arrived at Google headquarters, security escorted them quickly inside. Rajeev looked small and vulnerable, walking through the grand hallways he once knew so well. Employees passing by turned to stare, some recognizing him, their eyes filled with surprise and confusion. Sundar stayed close to him, his presence like a silent shield. They entered the conference room again, the same board members waiting anxiously. Rajeev stood at the center, his hands trembling as he looked around. James stepped forward cautiously. "Rajeev, we need your help to stop this threat," he said. Rajeev took a deep breath, gathering strength he didn't know he still had. "I never wanted this to happen," Rajeev began, his voice soft but clear. "I tried to warn you all. I documented everything because I believed someday someone might need to know the truth. I never intended for it to be used as a weapon." His words hung in the air like heavy fog. But Sundar stepped beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his back. "We know, Rajeev. We believe you," Sundar said firmly. Slowly, Rajeev began to outline the vulnerability in detail, explaining technical aspects so precisely that the entire room fell into stunned silence. His mind, though tired, still carried the same sharp brilliance that once drove him to the top. He spoke for hours, drawing diagrams, showing old code snippets, and explaining exactly where the system could be exploited. As he spoke, Sundar watched him with a mix of pride and sorrow. He realized how much they had lost when they let Rajeev walk away. They hadn't just lost an employee. They had lost a guardian, a true believer in safety and integrity. When Rajeev finally finished, he looked up, his face pale and exhausted, sweat dripping from his forehead. James nodded slowly. "We can fix this. We can stop the leak," he said. But then, as relief began to fill the room, a young technician rushed in, his face white with panic. "Sir, the hacker just moved. They're starting to release partial data now. We're running out of time," he shouted. The room exploded into chaos. People jumped up, grabbing laptops, calling different departments. Rajeev turned to Sundar, his face determined. "I need to access the main control room now," he said. Sundar nodded instantly. "Do whatever you need," he said. Security led Rajeev down the hall at a sprint, Sundar close behind. It entered the control center, a large room filled with screens, data streams, and engineers typing frantically. Rajeev sat down at a main terminal, his fingers moving across the keyboard faster than anyone had seen in years. Sweat dripped from his forehead, but his eyes burned with focus. Sundar stood behind him, watching silently, every second feeling like an eternity. As Rajeev worked, the tension in the room felt like it might snap at any moment. One engineer whispered updates, others monitored incoming threats. Rajeev's breathing grew heavier, his body trembling under the weight of responsibility and exhaustion. Finally, after what felt like forever, he pressed one final key, leaned back, and let out a long breath. The room fell silent. "It's done," he whispered. "I closed the back door. The data is safe." Everyone in the room exhaled at once, a wave of relief washing over them. Sundar stepped forward, pulling Rajeev into a hug so tight that it seemed to hold the weight of all their shared memories and regrets. "You saved us," Sundar said softly, his voice choked with emotion. Rajeev looked up at him, his eyes filled. "With tears we saved each other," he replied. The moment the room seemed to disappear, leaving only two old friends standing together. Bound not by titles or power, but by trust and shared battles, the other engineers began to clap slowly at first, then louder, until the entire room was filled with the sound of grateful applause. Rajeev looked around, overwhelmed, his lips trembling, as he tried to process the sudden flood of respect and acceptance. But just as they started to celebrate, an alert appeared on one of the main screens. It was a message from the hacker. "This isn't over, I have more. Watch your back." The room went silent again, the joy turning into cold fear. In seconds, Rajeev's face turned pale, and he leaned heavily on the desk, breathing hard. Sundar's eyes darkened with worry. He knew they had only won a battle, not the war. He turned to Rajeev, gripping his shoulders firmly. "We'll face this together. I promise you," he said. Rajeev nodded weakly, but there was a deep exhaustion in his eyes, as if he knew the road ahead would be even harder. As they stood there in the dim light of the control room, the weight of what they had just faced hung thick in the air. Sundar looked at Rajeev and saw a man reborn, but also a man deeply scarred. He realized that saving Rajeev was more than just fixing a system vulnerability. It was about giving him a reason to live again, a chance to rebuild his broken spirit. But now, with a new threat looming, They had no choice but to stand strong and prepare for the next wave of attacks. Sundar knew that Rajeev's battle wasn't just technical, it was personal, and the enemy might be closer than they ever imagined. As Sundar guided Rajeev out of the control room, he glanced back at the screen one last time. The hacker's message glowed like a warning in the dark, a promise of more storms. To come, Sundar felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew this was far from over. He knew that to truly save Rajeev, possibly the company, they would have to uncover secrets buried deep within their own walls. He took a deep breath, steadying himself for the battles ahead. He looked at Rajeev, his old friend who had already lost so much, and silently vowed to protect him no matter the cost. And as they stepped into the hallway, the lights flickered slightly, as if echoing the uncertainty ahead. Rajeev stumbled a little, and Sundar caught him quickly, steadying him with a gentle but firm hand. Rajeev looked up at Sundar, his face pale and tired, his eyes silently asking if they could really survive what was coming next. Sundar gave him a small, reassuring nod, though inside he wasn't sure himself. They walked slowly together, two men against a rising storm, unaware that the next revelation would shake not just their lives, but the entire foundation of Google itself. The hallway outside the control room felt colder than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Sundar walked beside Rajeev, keeping one steadying hand lightly on his back, ready to catch him if he stumbled again. Rajeev's steps were slow and heavy, each one a reminder of how deeply exhaustion and old pain had carved into his spirit. Sundar watched him closely, his mind racing through strategies, trying to prepare for the hacker's next move. But deep inside, beyond the CEO mindset, there was something even stronger, a silent, burning promise to protect Rajeev no matter what. As they stepped into Sundar's private office, the door clicked shut softly behind them, creating a small island of silence in the sea of chaos beyond. Rajeev collapsed into a leather chair, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his trembling hands. Sundar stood in front of him, taking a slow, deep breath. He looked out the tall window where the late afternoon sunlight painted long golden lines across the city, a peaceful image that felt almost cruel now. He turned back to Rajeev, his heart aching. "We need to figure out who this hacker is," Sundar said quietly, his voice careful but firm. Rajeev didn't look up. His voice came out muffled. "I have a feeling this is someone from inside." Those words struck Sundar like a sharp slap. His mind flashed back to the endless board meetings, the confidential discussions, the quiet betrayals that sometimes whispered around the edges of high power. "What do you mean?" Sundar asked, moving closer, his eyes sharp and searching. Rajeev finally lifted his head, his eyes red and glassy. "When I left Google, I kept copies of my research because I was afraid that the flaws I found would be ignored forever and that people would get hurt. I encrypted them, hid them so deeply that even the best hackers would take years to find them. But someone did find them. And to do that, they had to know exactly where to look." Sundar listened intently, feeling a cold dread creep up his spine. "So you think it's someone who knew you well enough to guess where you'd hide them," he said slowly. Rajeev nodded, his face drawn tight with pain. "Someone who knew my habits, my fears, my patterns," he said softly. The room grew heavy with the weight of old memories and hidden wounds. Sundar felt anger rising inside him, a quiet, burning rage at whoever had pushed Rajeev so far down this dark path. He leaned forward, his voice low but strong. "We will find them. We will stop them, together." Just then, Maya knocked gently and slipped inside, her face pale and worried. "Sir," she said, her voice almost trembling, "there's been another message. It's a video this time. They're threatening to reveal everything in 48 hours if we don't pay." She handed Sundar a tablet. He took it carefully, feeling the smooth, cold weight in his hands. He pressed play, and the screen flickered to life. A hooded figure sat in a dark room, face hidden, voice distorted. "Google has lied to the world," the figure said slowly. "Their systems are flawed, and they ignored the man who tried to save them. Pay up, or the world will know everything, and trust will be destroyed forever." Sundar felt his jaw tighten, his chest rising and falling in heavy waves. Rajeev watched the video, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and guilt. When the video ended, the room felt even colder. Sundar stood silently, his mind spinning, weaving through endless possibilities. He turned to Maya. "Call an emergency board meeting," he said firmly. "Everyone, tonight." Maya nodded and left quickly, her footsteps fading down the hall. Sundar turned to Rajeev, who looked smaller than ever in the big chair. "You're coming with me," Sundar said. Rajeev hesitated. "Are you sure?" "They all hate me," he whispered. Sundar shook his head, stepping forward and placing a hand firmly on Rajeev's shoulder. "They need to hear the truth from you. It's the only way," he said. As they walked together to the boardroom, Sundar felt the weight of each step. The hallway lights flickered occasionally, and every flicker felt like a shiver crawling up his spine. Rajeev walked beside him, head down, as if carrying 1,000 invisible stones on his back. When they finally arrived, the boardroom was all ready. Full voices rose and fell, a chaotic hum of fear and blame. Sundar stepped in, silence spread like a sudden storm, all eyes turning to him. Rajeev stood just behind, his eyes darting nervously, his breath shallow and quick. Sundar didn't waste time. He stepped forward, raising a hand to quiet the room. "We all know why we're here," he began, his voice strong but calm. "Someone is trying to destroy us from within, using information that was never meant to harm, but to protect." He paused, letting his words settle like stones in water. He gestured for Rajeev to step forward. Rajeev hesitated, his hand shaking slightly, but Sundar gave him a small nod of encouragement. Rajeev took a deep breath, stepped forward, and looked around the room. "I never wanted this," he began, his voice shaky but clear. "Years ago, I found vulnerabilities that could have hurt millions. I tried to get the board to listen, but they refused. Kept the data because I was scared they'd cover it up forever." The board members shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at each other, others staring down at their hands. "I never wanted to use it as a weapon," Rajeev continued. "Someone else did, and that someone knew me well enough to find my hidden files. This is not just an attack on Google. It's an attack on truth, on integrity." His voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if the old fire inside him was waking up again after years of cold silence. Sundar watched, pride shining in his eyes. He saw the old Rajeev standing there, the brilliant mind who once inspired whole teams to reach higher. Suddenly, one of the senior board members, a tall man named Robert, stood up abruptly, his face red with anger. "How do we know you're not behind this yourself? Maybe you planned this to get revenge," he shouted. The room erupted into loud voices, accusations flying like arrows. Rajeev stepped back, his face draining of color. Sundar stepped forward quickly, raising both hands. "Enough," shouted, his voice slicing through the noise like a blade. The room fell silent again. Sundar turned to Robert, his eyes sharp and cold. "I know Rajeev. I trust him with my life. And if any of you had listened back then, we wouldn't be here today," he said, each word heavy with authority and disappointment. Robert opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when he saw the fierce determination in Sundar's eyes. Sundar turned back to the room. "This is not the time to fight among ourselves. This is the time to unite and find the real enemy," he said, his voice dropping to a quieter, more intimate tone. The board members looked at each other, the weight of his words sinking in. Rajeev stood still, breathing heavily, his hands clenched at his sides. Sundar turned to him, offering a small, reassuring nod. Slowly, the board members began to calm down. Someone suggested tracing the hackers' communication channels. Another proposed checking internal access logs. Ideas started flowing, the room transforming from a battlefield into a war room. Rajeev stepped forward again, his voice stronger now. "I can help. I know my data better than anyone. If you let me, I can help track the hacker," he said. After a moment's pause, the board nodded, agreeing one by one. Sundar watched the shift in the room with a cautious sense of hope. For the first time in years, they were listening to Rajeev. Hours passed as teams worked through the night, guided by Rajeev's detailed knowledge and Sundar's steady leadership. Rajeev sat in front of a large screen, tracing code, analyzing digital footprints, and unraveling patterns. Sundar stayed close, moving between groups, encouraging them, holding the fragile sense of unity together with quiet words and firm guidance. The atmosphere felt electric, filled with both fear and a renewed sense of purpose. Finally, as the first light of dawn painted the sky, Rajeev leaned back in his chair, his eyes wide with realization. "I found it," he whispered, almost to himself. Sundar rushed over, his heart pounding. "Who is it?" he asked urgently. Rajeev looked up, his face pale as paper, his lips trembling. He turned the screen toward Sundar. The name glowed in the dim light, each letter cutting deeper than any blade. It was a name both of them knew well. A name that carried years of trust and friendship, Robert. Sundar felt the blood drain from his face, his hands turning cold and numb. "Robert," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Rajeev nodded slowly, his eyes filling with tears. He was the one. He knew everything about me. "He knew where to look," Rajeev said, his voice breaking. Sundar stood frozen, staring at the name as if it might vanish if he blinked. He felt a mix of betrayal and rage boiling inside him, fighting to burst out. RJ looked at Sundar, his eyes wide and scared. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice soft and small, like a lost child. Sundar swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew that every move from this point forward had to be precise, or everything they had worked for would shatter. He put a hand on Rajeev's shoulder. "We bring him in. We confront him with the truth," Sundar said firmly, his voice low but powerful. Rajeev nodded weakly, wiping at his eyes as they stood together, watching the sun rise beyond the glass walls. Sundar felt the heavy burden of what lay ahead. He knew they were stepping into dangerous territory, facing not just a technical threat, but a deep human betrayal that could tear the very heart out of their company. But he also knew that they had no choice. They had to fight for the truth, for Rajeev, and for the future of everyone who believed in them. The boardroom would soon transform from a place of strategy to a place of reckoning. And Sundar knew they had to be ready. He looked at Rajeev, who seemed so fragile yet so brave, and felt a surge of protective strength rise within him. He promised himself again that no matter what happened next, he would stand by Rajeev's side until the very end. And just as the early morning light filled the room, turning the shadows into gold, Sundar's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Robert. "Meet me alone. I can explain." Sundar read the words, his fingers tightening around the phone, his heart thudding. In his chest, he knew this was the moment everything would change, for better or worse. The engineers began to move again, slowly at first, then with growing purpose. Rajeev took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I will help you rebuild the security architecture from the ground up," he said, his voice steady and determined. Sundar looked at him with deep respect and pride. "We do this together," Sundar said, placing a hand on Rajeev's shoulder, as the room filled with renewed energy. The two old friends stood side by side, ready to face whatever storms would come next. Yet in the corner of Sundar's mind, a shadow lingered. Robert's final words, his broken eyes, the sense that this was only the beginning of something much darker outside. The first rays of full morning sunlight spread across the sky, turning the clouds into waves of gold and pink. But inside, Sundar knew that the real dawn had not yet arrived. The true battle, the battle for trust, for friendship, for redemption, was just beginning. And somewhere out there, Robert was waiting, planning his next move. Sundar knew they had to be ready, and he silently vowed to himself that no matter what happened next, he would not let Rajeev fall again. He would protect him, protect the company, and protect the millions who unknowingly placed their hopes and dreams in the hands of their technology. And as he stood there, surrounded by his team, Sundar felt a quiet strength rise inside him. A strength built not from power or titles, but from love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds of human connection. He knew the path ahead would be dangerous and filled with pain, but he also knew they would walk it together, step by step, no matter how dark it became. As the sun rose higher, casting bright light through the tall windows of Google headquarters, It almost felt like the building itself was breathing, waking from a long nightmare. But inside, the air was thick with tension, every face marked with worry and quiet determination. Sundar stood in the middle of the main operations room, his eyes moving across rows of monitors filled with code and security diagrams. Engineers worked feverishly, typing in bursts of energy that echoed like a heartbeat in the large, bright space. Rajeev stood close by, leaning slightly on a desk for support, his fingers dancing across the keyboard with a kind of silent fury. That only came from a lifetime of passion and pain. They had decided together, after that long night, that there was no other choice but to rebuild the entire security architecture from the ground up. It was a dangerous decision, one that risked exposing them even more while the system was vulnerable. But it was also the only way to root out every hidden flaw, every weakness that Robert had found and might use again. Rajeev's face looked older under the harsh light, the lines deeper, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Yet there was a fire there too, a kind of defiant glow that seemed to grow brighter the more he worked. Sundar watched him, feeling a swell of pride and sorrow, so deep it almost hurt to breathe. He remembered the young Rajeev, full of wild ideas, laughing loudly in the old office cafeteria. His energy so contagious that even the most skeptical engineers would find themselves smiling. Now that same energy had transformed into a quiet, burning focus. It was like watching a fallen star trying to rise again, fighting against the dark sky that had swallowed it once before. "We need to isolate every critical module and rebuild their core dependencies," Rajeev explained, his voice hoarse but steady. His words flowed like a slow, steady river, calm on the surface but carrying enormous power beneath. Engineers nodded, some taking quick notes, others moving immediately to their stations to begin. Sundar moved among them, offering small words of encouragement. His presence a quiet force holding the fragile morale together. He didn't shout or command. Instead, he spoke softly, each word carrying weight because it came from a place of genuine care. Every few minutes, updates came in from different teams, small victories. New threats discovered, moments of collective relief when a critical vulnerability was patched. Each success felt like a tiny breath of air after nearly drowning. But beneath all this, an unspoken fear rippled quietly. Robert was still out there. Each line of code they repaired, each security measure they reinforced, could become another target for him. They all knew it, but none spoke it aloud. It hung in the space between them like a silent ghost, always watching. As the day turned slowly into afternoon, Rajeev suddenly paused. His eyes narrowing at a new data stream flashing across his screen, Sundar noticed immediately, stepping closer. "Why? Is it?" he asked, his voice low. Rajeev didn't answer at first. His fingers flew across the keyboard, eyes scanning rapidly. After a long moment, he leaned back, breathing heavily. "He's probing our new builds already," Rajeev said, his voice trembling slightly. "It means he's inside, still watching. Us, in real time." Sundar felt his stomach twist sharply, a cold wave flooding through his chest. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rajeev shook his head slowly, his face pale. "Must have placed a root-level backdoor before he left. A hidden entry, buried so deep that no one could see it without knowing exactly where to look," Rajeev said. His words fell into the room like heavy stones, each one making the silence even deeper. The engineers around them stopped, their fingers hovering above keyboards, eyes wide with fear. Sundar looked at each of them, seeing the panic starting to creep up their faces. He stepped forward, his hands raised slightly. "Listen to me," he began, his voice strong and clear despite the storm inside him. "We have faced worse before. We survived because we stood together. We believed in each other. We will do it again. We'll find that back door, and we'll close it forever. We do not give up. Not now, not ever." Slowly, the engineers began to nod, the energy in the room shifting from fear to a raw, determined focus. Rajeev turned back to his screen, his fingers trembling but moving faster than before. Sundar leaned over his shoulder, watching lines of code fly past like a rushing river. Every few seconds, Rajeev would pause, adjust, dive deeper. It felt like surgery, delicate, dangerous, every move critical. Sweat ran down Rajeev's face, dripping onto the desk. But he didn't stop, didn't even blink. Outside the glass walls, the city moved on as if nothing had changed. Cars rushed by, people sipped their coffees, children laughed in schoolyards. Inside, time seemed to move differently. Each second stretched out, sharp and heavy with consequence. Sundar felt every beat of his heart echo in his head, each one whispering reminders of what was at stake. Not just a company, but millions of lives, dreams, and the fragile trust that held them all together. Hours passed in this strange, tense dance. Finally, just as the first signs of evening began to paint the sky outside in deep orange and purple, Rajeev stopped abruptly. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling. Sundar felt his breath catch. "What is it?" he asked. Turned slowly, his eyes wide, a strange mix of relief and horror. "I found it," he whispered. "The back door. It's here, hidden inside an old authentication module. If I remove it, we can lock him out completely." A hush fell over the room. Sundar stared at him, his heart pounding. "Do it," he said, his voice firm but gentle. Rajeev nodded slowly, turning back to his screen. His fingers began to move. Again, this time with a sharp, decisive rhythm, like a sculptor carving away the last piece of marble to reveal the final shape. Every engineer in the room watched silently, holding their breath. The sound of Rajeev's typing was the only thing that existed in that moment. A delicate music that carried their hopes and fears together. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rajeev pressed the final key. He leaned back, his whole body trembling, his eyes closing as a single tear rolled down his cheek. Sundar stepped forward, resting a hand gently on his shoulder. "It's done," Rajeev whispered, his voice breaking with exhaustion and relief. The room remained silent for a long moment, then slowly, softly, one engineer began to clap, another joined, then another, until the entire room was filled with the sound of applause. Echoing against the glass walls like a rising wave, opened his eyes, looking around in shock, as if he couldn't quite believe the warmth surrounding him. Sundar bent down, his voice low, but filled with emotion. "You did it. You saved us all," Sundar said. Rajeev shook his head weakly. "We did it. You believed in me when no one else did," he said. Sundar's eyes softened, his throat tight with emotion. He nodded slowly, his hand still resting on Rajiv's shoulder like an anchor. As the applause faded, Maya entered quietly, her eyes wide with wonder. "The system is stable," she announced. "No more external signals. The breach is closed." The room erupted into cheers, some engineers hugging each other, others slumping over their desks in exhausted relief. But beneath the joy, knew that the battle wasn't truly over. Robert was still out there, and he wouldn't stop until he had taken everything from them. Sundar turned to Rajeev, who sat slumped in the chair, his face pale, but eyes shining with a quiet strength. "We have to find him before he can strike again," Sundar said. Rajeev looked up, nodding slowly. "I know, but at least now he can't hurt the people anymore," Rajeev replied. Sundar nodded, feeling a deep, quiet determination rise inside him. He knew this was the moment to turn defense into offense, to finally bring the fight to Robert. "Rest for a while," Sundar said gently. "You've done enough for today." Rajeev opened his mouth to argue, but closed it again, exhaustion finally pulling him under. Sundar watched as Maya guided him to a quiet office to rest, her arm around his shoulders. For the first time in years, Rajeev allowed someone to help him without protest. Once Rajeev was gone, Sundar turned back to the team. He stepped forward, his voice strong and clear. "We have protected our people today, but this is not the end. We must track Robert, expose him, and make sure he cannot harm anyone again. We fight for every user who trusts us, for every engineer who gave their heart to this work, and for every dream that depends on what we build. We stand together," Sundar said, his words ringing out like a bell of resolve. The room erupted in a unified, powerful cheer. Engineers stood taller, their exhaustion momentarily replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Sundar felt a quiet pride as he looked around. Pride not in their technology, but in their humanity, their ability to rise even when crushed, to believe even when betrayed. As the night crept in, painting the world in deep blues and blacks, Sundar slipped into his office alone. He closed the door gently and walked to the window. Looking out at the sea of city lights twinkling like stars scattered across the earth, his reflection stared back at him in the glass, the lines of worry and fatigue etched deep into his face. He thought about Rajeev, about the countless unseen warriors in his team, about Robert and the dark choices that had led them here. He let out a long, quiet breath and closed his eyes, his mind turning through plans, strategies, and quiet prayers. He knew they had won a battle today, but the war was still ahead, lurking in the shadows beyond the bright city lights. He whispered softly to himself, "We are stronger together, no matter what comes next." And as he stood there in the silent room, his hand resting lightly on the cold glass, he felt the spark of something powerful and unbreakable inside him, a promise, a vow that no darkness would ever truly conquer them as long as they stood united. Far away, in the hidden corners of the city, Robert watched the news on his small, flickering monitor. His eyes narrowed, a twisted smile slowly curling across his lips. "Well played, Sundar," he whispered to the empty room, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the table. But the game is far from over. The night felt endless, as Sundar stood by the window, his forehead resting lightly against the cool glass. The city lights flickered like small fires, each one carrying its own story, its own quiet struggles and silent victories. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in slowly, holding the weight of everything that had happened close to his chest. When he opened them again, he felt a shift deep inside, a new kind of calm determination that felt heavier and stronger than anything he had carried before. Somewhere in the building, Rajeev slept fitfully in a small office room, his dreams haunted by old failures and new fears. Yet even in his restless sleep, there was a soft peace on his face, a fragile sign that the light inside him was finally beginning to return. Sundar thought about all the years Rajeev had spent in the shadows, blamed, ignored, and finally forgotten. He thought about how close they had come to losing everything, not just the company, but the essence of who they were as human beings. As friends, as protectors of a world that trusted them without question. Maya entered quietly, her steps almost silent on the polished floor. She stopped a few feet behind Sundar, holding a fresh report in her trembling hands. "Sir," she said softly, not wanting to break the fragile moment. Sundar turned, his eyes weary but clear. Maya stepped forward, offering the paper to him. "We traced Robert's last signal," she said. "He's hiding in an abandoned server facility outside the city. If we move now, we can catch him before he vanishes again." Her voice carried both fear and hope, like a candle flame flickering in the dark. Sundar took the paper slowly, his fingers brushing lightly over the words. He looked up at Maya, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, the unspoken questions. He nodded once, firmly. "Assemble a small team, quiet and fast. We end this tonight," he said, his voice low but filled with steel. Maya nodded and left quickly, her footsteps fading into the deep silence of the building. As Sundar walked down the long hallway toward Rajeev's room, he felt his heartbeat grow heavier, each step echoing inside him like a drumbeat of destiny. When he entered the small office, Rajeev stirred, his eyes opening slowly, confusion flickering across his face. Sundar sat beside him, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's time," Sundar said softly. Rajeev blinked, his mind slowly catching up. He pushed himself up, his body still heavy with exhaustion, but his eyes suddenly sharp and clear. "You're going after him?" Rajeev whispered, almost as if he were talking to himself. "We are," Sundar corrected, his eyes locking with Rajeev's. "I need you with me. He's your ghost too." For a moment, Rajeev hesitated, fear pulling at the edges of his resolve. But then he took a slow, steady breath, nodding with quiet determination. "I won't run anymore," Rajeev said. Sundar smiled slightly, the corners of his eyes softening for just a moment. They moved quickly, gathering in the underground garage where Maya and a small group of trusted engineers waited. Each face was pale, but set, each pair of eyes filled with unspoken oaths. They climbed into two quiet black vans, the engines humming low as they slipped out into the sleeping city. The road stretched ahead of them like dark rivers, the only sounds the soft rhythm of tires and the quiet. Nervous breaths of the team. The abandoned server facility rose from the ground like a dead giant, its metal walls rusted and broken in. Places, weeds and wild plants crawling across the concrete. The moon hung above them, bright and watchful, casting long shadows that seemed to move and whisper as they stepped carefully toward the main entrance. Sundar led them, his steps confident but careful, his mind locked on the moment ahead. Inside. The air was cold and heavy, filled with the smell of dust and old dead electricity. Wires hung from the ceilings like vines in a forgotten jungle, and broken screens blinked with ghostly static. Somewhere deeper in the darkness they heard the faint click of a keyboard, a sound so small, yet so loud in the stillness. Sundar raised his hand, signaling the team to stop. He and Rajeev exchanged a glance, silent agreement passing between them. They moved forward alone, deeper into the dark heart of the building. As they turned a final corner, they saw him, Robert, sitting in front of an old terminal, his fingers dancing across the keys with feverish desperation. His face was pale and thin, dark circles under his eyes, his hair wild and tangled. When he heard them, he didn't look up at first. "You're too late," he said, his voice echoing softly, almost like a ghost. "I've set the final sequence. In minutes, everything will fall apart. Your precious empire, your trust, everything." Sundar stepped forward slowly, his voice calm but sharp. "Robert, stop. This isn't you. It doesn't have to end this way," he said. Robert laughed, a high, brittle sound that scraped at the edges of the room. "You never understood," Robert hissed, finally turning to face them. His eyes were wild, shining with a cold, broken light. "I was always in your shadow, always the invisible one. This is the only way they'll remember me." Rajeev stepped forward suddenly, his voice shaking but loud. "They'll remember you as a traitor, as someone who hurt the very people you claimed to want to help. Please, Robert." "Don't do this," Rajeev pleaded, his hand slightly raised as if trying to hold back a storm. For a moment, Robert's eyes flickered, a crack of doubt flashing like lightning across his face. He stared at Rajeev, breathing heavily, his fingers hovering above the keyboard. Sundar seized that moment, stepping closer, his voice a low, firm whisper. "You wanted to be seen. We see you now. You wanted to matter. You do. But this isn't the way to heal the wounds inside you. This is only destruction. You still have a choice, Robert. End it now, and we can help you." "We can fix this," Sundar said, every word carrying the heavy weight of truth and sorrow. Robert trembled, his hand shaking violently above the keyboard. His eyes darted between Sundar and Rajeev, and for a brief second, it seemed like he might listen. But then, a loud alarm began to blare from the terminal. Robert's eyes widened in shock. "No," he screamed, slamming his hand down on the keyboard. Sundar lunged forward, grabbing Robert's wrist, wrestling him away from the terminal. Rajeev rushed in too, grabbing the other arm, the three of them crashing to the ground in a tangled, desperate struggle. The terminal screen flashed with lines of code, a timer counting down in bright red. "We have to stop it," Rajeev shouted, pushing himself up and diving for the keyboard. Sundar pinned Robert to the floor, holding him firmly despite the wild thrashing. Robert screamed, his voice cracking with rage and fear, tears streaming down his face. "It's too late." "You can't stop it," he cried. Rajeev's fingers flew across the keys, sweat dripping from his forehead, his breath loud and sharp. Sundar watched from the floor, holding Robert down with every ounce of strength he had left. The timer dropped lower and lower. 10, 9, 8. Rajeev's hands moved faster, a blur of frantic precision. 7, 6, 5. The room seemed to shrink, every sound echoing inside Sundar's mind like a roaring sea. 4, 3. Then, suddenly, the timer froze at 2. Rajeev let out a choked sob of relief, his fingers hovering above the keys as if afraid to move. The red numbers blinked, then slowly vanished, replaced by a single word: system neutralized. The alarm stopped abruptly, leaving a deep, ringing silence that filled every corner of the dark room. Robert stopped struggling, his body going limp beneath Sundar's grip. He lay there, staring up at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. His eyes, once wild and sharp, now looked empty and lost, like a man staring into the ruins of his own soul. Sundar slowly released his hold, standing up shakily, and looking down at Robert with a deep, quiet sadness. Rajeev slumped in the chair, his head dropping into his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sundar stepped over and placed a hand on his back, steady and warm. "You did it," Sundar said softly. Rajeev looked up, his face wet with tears, and managed a small broken smile. "We did it," he whispered. Outside, the rest of the team moved in cautiously, their faces a mix of shock and relief. Maya stepped forward, her eyes wide as she looked at the frozen terminal and the broken man on the floor. Sundar turned to her, nodding once. "It's over," he said, his voice tired, but firm. She nodded back, swallowing hard, and moved to help Rajeev stand. Robert was led away quietly, his head bowed, his steps unsteady. No one spoke as he passed, each person lost in their own thoughts, their own silent prayers. As he disappeared into the shadows, a strange hush fell over the group, a mix of grief and a strange, bittersweet relief. Back at headquarters, the team gathered in the main room. Sundar stood at the front, Rajeev beside him. He looked out at all the faces, each one reflecting exhaustion, fear, and the faint, fragile glow of hope. "Tonight we face not just a threat to our systems, but to our very hearts," Sundar began, his voice low but strong. "We prove that when we stand together, when we trust each other, no darkness can truly defeat us." He paused, looking over at Rajeev, who looked back at him with shining eyes. "We lost a lot," Sundar continued, his voice softer now, "but we also found something stronger. We found the courage to face our mistakes, to protect each other, and to rebuild what was broken." His words washed over the room like a gentle tide, quieting every restless heart. Rajeev stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. "I hid for so long because I thought I had failed everyone. But tonight, you all showed me that failure is not the end. It's just a step on the way back to the light," he said, his eyes filling with tears again. There was a long, deep silence, then a single clap from the back of the room. Slowly more joined in, until the whole room erupted in a thunderous applause that echoed like a heartbeat through the glass walls. After the meeting, Sundar and Rajeev stepped outside onto the rooftop terrace. The sky above them was painted with countless stars, each one shimmering in the quiet night. They stood side by side, the wind playing gently with their hair and clothes. Rajeev turned to Sundar, his voice barely above a whisper.
"Thank you
for not giving up on me," he said. Sundar turned to him, a soft, tired smile spreading across his face. "Thank you for coming back," Sundar replied. They stood there for a long time, watching the stars, breathing in the cool night air. Somewhere, far below, the city moved on, unaware of the battle that had just been won in its quietest corners. But up on that rooftop, in that still moment, they felt the weight lift off their shoulders, replaced by a deep, shared peace. Sundar looked up at the sky one last time before turning to go back inside, a final thought echoing in his mind like a soft prayer. No matter how dark the night, there is always a dawn waiting to break. And with that, he stepped forward, ready to face whatever new day would come, with Rajeev and the team at his side.